Sometimes a handheld comes along and I can kind of just guess what my script will look like before it even arrives. In the case of the Retroid Pocket Classic, I assumed it was just gonna basically be a bigger TrimUI brick, with maybe a tad better performance because it's running Android. I've reviewed enough of these cheaper handhelds at this point where the phrase plays PS1 and earlier great, but shows some cracks for Dreamcast, N64, and PSP feels like a bit of an inevitability. But this time, my assumptions were completely wrong. In fact, at $130, the Pocket Classic does so much well that it feels like it should be the standard we expect of handhelds around the $100 mark going forward. Some of that boils down to software. Unlike my cheaper handhelds, the Pocket Classic runs full Android 14 with Retroid's custom launcher. Just like on the Flip 2, it's a very comfortable skin to navigate using built-in controls. It makes jumping into a new game as easy as downloading more software. It's both aesthetically more appealing and feels more useful than even the best Linux distros on other handhelds. It's great, but what's even better is that Android is just, well, better at emulating certain systems. For other devices I've reviewed, many of the cracks forming for Dreamcast, N64, and PSP have felt like they come from the emulator being used. Whether standalone or as a RetroArch core, my first test is often just booting Paper Mario and watching a handheld immediately crash or glitch out. For those systems, Android just tends to be better. I'm several hours into Paper Mario on my Classic. There may be some minor glitches when I look hard enough, but it's been an otherwise smooth experience. And if it weren't, I have the freedom to swap emulators at will without fumbling with system settings or swapping out the OS. That extra bit of freedom feels like a breath of fresh air after kind of just having to accept whatever emulator performance comes pre-installed on other hardware. After spending a few weeks with the Classic, it's hard to go back to those other devices without feeling that they're just a bit too locked down at the edges of their performance. But even far from those edges, the Classic still feels a bit better thanks to it not adding distracting overlays for every system by default. While the close to 10:9 display isn't quite ideal for 3:2 or 16:9 systems, it feels so much more comfortable to use than something like my RG Cube XX, thanks to the fact that I don't have to jump into RetroArch settings every time I boot up a new game or console to remove an overlay or tweak screen size settings to fill as much of the display as possible. The 1080p AMOLED display doesn't hurt either. While black bars can be distracting in extreme circumstances, having them be true black instead of partially lit goes a long way for keeping the experience comfortable. Even with the display clearly being aimed at playing Game Boy Color games, I've really enjoyed using it for Game Boy Advance emulation. Heck, even 16:9 systems like PSP don't feel terrible here. That's not all you can do with the Classic either. Inside, the handheld's powered by a Snapdragon G1 Gen 2. Qualcomm describes the lower-end chipset as ideal for cloud gaming and fanless gaming devices, which might be a bit of a surprise when I mention that it still handles GameCube and PS2 and some Wii emulation at full speed. Performance is best at 1x resolution, of course, and there might be some pain points based on specific games. But I've played more than a few Mario Kart Double Dash races on the Classic without a hitch, even without switching performance modes. Now, obviously, choice of games here is limited by the lack of sticks. The soft, springy face buttons are great, feeling just slightly cheaper than those on the Flip 2, but they're hardly good enough to play games that require camera controls or using a stick and D-pad at the same time. Ratchet and Clank and similar games run well, but they're essentially a tech demo on a handheld like this. Still, it seems perfect for games like Pokemon Colosseum or XD. Mapping the D-pad to both D-pad and left stick controls at the same time, it's felt oddly comfy playing through the first couple hours of Colosseum. I know there are quite a few folks out there buying handhelds like the Classic purely to play Pokemon games, who would get a kick out of being able to play both Leaf Green and Colosseum on a console the size and general shape of a Game Boy. Given how much handhelds twice the price struggled with this level of gameplay even a couple years ago, it still has me impressed. Technology is amazing. Though, don't get the wrong idea. The Classic's not exactly a perfect handheld. While I quite like the colorful look of my Pokemon Yellow colorway, the actual materials feel every bit like the $100 handheld it is. The heft and hand feel do place it leagues ahead of cheaper handhelds I have on hand, like the RG40 XXV. It's just that it's very obvious that the plastics are a bit on the cheaper side. And on the Android gaming side of things, I've also had problems running certain games. Often I'll test Android performance using Netflix's library of games, since they're cheap and easy to use, but all of them refuse to launch on the Classic. When I moved to a non-Netflix game, everything worked fine. Even cloud gaming experiences worked without any issue, beyond having to tweak aspect ratio settings a bit. So I have no clue what Netflix's problem is, or if that error will show up in other random games in the future. If you're buying a Classic for yourself, that just might be a sign to buy it mainly for emulation rather than Android gaming. Like the Flip 2, Retroid's launcher also has some notable faults, with menu customization being a bit awkward. That impacts the Classic less, since most of the systems it can handle are accounted for, but it's still worth noting. Similarly, I should note that Retroid's installation of various emulators at startup is appreciated, but the versions they downloaded for Dolphin in particular didn't give me quite as good an experience as when I downloaded Dolphin for myself from GitHub. Their version of RetroArch also randomly lost the ability to detect controller input right as we started filming B-roll for this video. So yeah, do yourself a favor and just download emulators from their source. As with all other Android handhelds, you'll need to jump into settings to initially set up your controller anyway, so the extra step to download isn't too impactful. Of course, if you're not a fan of that setup process in general, that is a strength other Linux-based handhelds have over the Classic. Although considering that those handhelds have often also required additional tweaking to remove overlays or correct control mapping, that distinction might be moot. And then, of course, there's also the whole issue of tariffs if you live in the US. For $130, the Classic has great performance. However, if import fees cause costs to creep towards $200, the value may not feel quite as good. Personally, I probably wouldn't spend over $170 for one of these, and even then I'd be thinking twice. Unlike the Flip 2, there's also no real alternatives or solutions to the issue to get around those fees at the low end where the Classic sits. You're not exactly walking into Best Buy to grab a vertical handheld for under $200 or anything, and jumping from $130 to $300 for the cheapest Android handheld I can buy in one of those stores might be a bit much. The stroke of stupidity that is the increased tariffs has the potential to affect pretty much all competing handhelds below $200 unless a company manages to stash inventory in the US. It's just kind of something you gotta keep in mind at this point. Those downsides aside though, the Classic has surprisingly good performance for the price. Even if the plastics could feel more premium, it also feels solidly built with a great OLED display that gets more than bright enough to play outdoors, if reflections aren't an issue. The buttons feel good, the software feels great, and probably the biggest potential letdown is that the lack of sticks prevent it from really hitting its performance limits. But that's also kind of the reason why the Retroid Pocket 4 still exists. Opting for the 6-button variant might also give a bit more leeway for folks wanting as many control options as possible, especially for maybe Saturn and 64 gameplay. It's not totally necessary though. Even with the default control scheme, the Classic feels great for older handheld gameplay, as well as any PS1, N64, Dreamcast, or many GameCube games that don't require using the full controller at once. I imagine swapping one of the full-size action buttons for 3 half-size buttons might also not be the most comfortable experience. There's a lot to love here, and it kind of puts a lot of the other handhelds I've reviewed to shame. While I'm a fan of companies exploring different form factors, sizes, and software ideas, it's going to be hard to recommend any future devices that can't at least perform this well. Unless they set at half the price or have an entirely unique form factor, of course. Retroid has demonstrated that the technology exists to create something that looks good and performs much better than the standard Linux handheld at only $120 to $130. While many of those other devices might sell for $40 to $50 less, there's something to be said about spending a bit more money to buy something of much higher quality that will last longer. Overall, it just feels time that the other manufacturers stepped up their efforts to make better performing, affordable handhelds instead of providing the same damn thing in 20 different shells. Those are my thoughts, though. I'd love to know yours. Are you interested in buying a Retroid Pocket Classic, or have you already bought one and have thoughts of your own? Let me know down in the comments. As always, if you found this video interesting or informative, go ahead and give it a like to let me know, then get subscribed for more handheld reviews in the very near future. There wasn't a great spot to add it to this script, but battery life is also surprisingly good on the Classic. On top of playing for a few hours straight, my typical tests include letting handhelds sit for a few days to capture standby power drain. During gameplay, the battery drains at a relatively slow pace, especially with the fan turned off, and I've seen it drain less than a couple percentage points when left to sit for a few days. All of which has been great for my typical sporadic play sessions. But anyway, that's going to be all for this video. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. Until next time, catch you later.